Ja, ein herzliches Willkommen zu unserem Webinar Böll.Global 7. Das ist eine Reihe der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, die sich mit den Folgen der Pandemie vor allem beschäftigt. Ich möchte Sie herzlich begrüßen, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Freundinnen und Freunde. Vielen Dank für Ihr Interesse an diesem Böll.Global. Wir möchten uns heute mit dem Thema globale Impfstoffverteilung, Impfstoffgerechtigkeit und Fragen rund um inwiefern diese Impfstoffverteilung genutzt wird, um geopolitisch Einfluss zu nehmen, um ökonomische Interessen zu verteidigen. Mein Name ist Barbara Unmüßig, ich bin Vorstand der Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung und freue mich, dass ich meine beiden Gäste begrüßen darf. Herzlich willkommen und ich muss auf Deutsch sprechen, leider, weil wir einen Übersetzungskanal haben. Herzlich willkommen, Zainab Usman nach Washington. Dort ist es jetzt mittags, nicht wie bei uns später Nachmittag. Ich werde Zainab Usman genauso wie Tahir Amin gleich nochmal vorstellen. Grüße nach London und Grüße nach Washington. Erlauben Sie mir am Anfang noch kurz ein paar technische Hinweise. Das ist notwendig, wenn wir auch global miteinander ins Gespräch kommen wollen. Der erste Punkt ist nochmal Übersetzung. Sie sehen einen Globus, bei dem Sie die Sprache wählen können. Sie bekommen dann eine Übersetzung, weil unsere beiden Gäste, Tahir und Zainab, auf Englisch sprechen werden. Sie finden auch noch Hinweise im Chat von unserem technischen Moderator. Der wird Ihnen auch noch Instruktionen geben, wie Sie mit der Übersetzung dann zurechtkommen. Dann möchten wir natürlich zu einem guten Teil auch mit Ihnen ins Gespräch kommen und Ihnen die Möglichkeit geben, Fragen zu stellen. Tun Sie das bitte über diesen Tool F&A, Fragen und Antworten. Meine Mitarbeiterin Alexandra Sitenko wird für Sie so etwas wie eine Anwältin des Publikums sein und wird dann, wenn ich Sie dazu auffordere, auf jeden Fall Ihre Fragen sortieren und dann auch hier einsprechen. Sagen Sie, an wen Sie Ihre Fragen richten. Das hilft mir dann auch in der Moderation an Zainab Usman oder Tahir Amin die Fragen zu stellen. Soweit zum technischen Ablauf.
So far on the technical issues. So we are now focusing on a very topical, very interesting subject. We are experiencing a second, third, fourth wave of the pandemic with a high number of infected people and high number of people who are dying, especially in India and Brazil. The consequences of the lockdown, and this is what we've also talked about in the series. So the consequences of the lockdown predominantly affect the most vulnerable and poorer parts of society throughout the world, but in particular, of course, the poorer countries who have not yet received a lot of vaccine, whereas we and the whole world knows that the inoculation, that vaccines will be a main aid in order to tackle the pandemic. So the whole world is actually focusing on a solution, which is the vaccines. We have developed vaccines in an unprecedented way and number, and all in all, there are 300 different vaccination or vaccine projects, so projects that are focusing on vaccine development and also focusing on the mutations and also focusing on making the vaccines more easily handled, so that they can be more easily handled. And of course, even we have difficulty in organizing everything. So it's quite important how vaccines are being distributed, whether there is a sufficient supply of vaccines, in particular in the global south. The vaccination capacity or production capacities are scarce, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and also within the WTO, the TRIPS agreement, which deals with intellectual property rights and intellectual property right protection, say that within or since October, there's been a proposal within the WTO by India and South Africa on the temporary suspension of the protection of patents. And you could see over months that the industrialized countries, Switzerland, the EU, but also the US, blocked the waiver by South Africa and India and uttered constantly new concerns. So it was quite remarkable that the US administration last week announced that they are prepared to think about a temporary waiver of the patent protections. And this was really highly welcomed. However, we could also see how or that the EU did not agree or was not in agreement as such, and that Chancellor Merkel raised concerns and said, well, we won't agree. So it remains interesting how in the second half of May and at the beginning of June, the new negotiations within the WTO will eventually end. And I will also talk about that with one of our guests. So vaccination, distribution and production, as I've already said, are part of a debate whether we manage to succeed in creating justice based on global solidarity. We all experience that only few vaccines have been supplied to, in particular, the poorer countries. And this is also something that I would like to discuss with my guests. We will focus on the following question: what is the economic, the political, and also geopolitical calculation behind it, behind the fact that some countries link the supply of vaccines to negotiations and certain developments? This will also be part of our discussion today. I would like to start now today with the current vaccination situation. And here I would like to start with Zainab Usman, and I would briefly introduce her. Zainab Usman is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And her areas of expertise include economic policy, energy policy, and also emerging economies in Africa. And also because Africa is actually a little bit excluded of the vaccination discussion, the topic of vaccination justice. And afterwards, I will introduce our second guest, Tahir Amin. And now I would like to start with the first question to Zainab. And I already touched upon it. I was just told, because we were a little bit nervous at the beginning, I was just told that our guest from Brazil, Adriana, she unfortunately had to cancel 4 o'clock today. She is sick. We are very sorry about this. 4 o'clock, she said she won't make it. And we wish her well, all the best to Adriana Afternoon. We are, of course, missing the Latin American perspective. I'm very sorry about that. I was very much looking forward to discussing with her. But with Zainab and Tahir, we will have a good panel in order to bring us up to date surrounding the topics that I've just mentioned. So apologies, and I will start anew. I just introduced Zainab. Zainab, my question to you is, the African continent has so far received only about 2% of the jabs distributed worldwide, but we know that even these supplies have not yet been distributed or vaccinated. So how do you see or assess the situation in the African countries? Who gets the vaccine and who does not get vaccine? And how are the countries dealing with it? The floor is yours. Once again, one webcam.
Your micro.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for having me participate in this important discussion. What is also quite interesting is I've been on quite a number of panels discussing this very same topic since early this year. And it is rather unfortunate that we are still talking about the same thing, months down the line when vaccination drives have started. And, if care is not taken, we're still going to be discussing the same thing probably until the end of the year. So I hope the relevant action is taken to ensure that there's a fair and equitable vaccine access across the world. Now, coming to your question on the African continent, what is going on? The vaccines that have been delivered, is there low uptake? What explains the situation? So I'm going to mention 2 or 3 things right now. The first is really the discrepancy in access to vaccine supplies that is underpinning the slow vaccination drive across Africa, and then the implications of this slow vaccination drive. So now starting with the discrepancy itself, this is something we've all seen with headlines across the world in terms of how, there's a gap between some wealthy countries, particularly in North America, the USA, but also increasingly in Europe, in the UK, and then increasingly in Europe as the vaccination drive picks up steam. Between those countries and those in, quote unquote, the global south, developing countries, especially in Africa. So according to, the one campaign has this COVID-19 vaccine tracker in Africa. And, there are so many of these trackers, but I'm using figures from the one campaign. According to them, as of May 10th, which was, a few days ago, 51 people per 100 had received a vaccine in North America. 35 people per 100 had received a vaccine in Europe, whereas only 2 per 100 had or have received a vaccine in Africa, the COVID-19 vaccine. And G7 countries apparently have 1 billion excess vaccine doses, whereas, you have a supply gap in many countries, especially in Africa. And for those countries, those that have received the AstraZeneca vaccine through COVAX, some of them are actually having to deal with expired vaccines. So countries like Botswana, like the DRC, like Malawi, like South Sudan, have either had to dispose of, tens of thousands of doses because the expiration date was imminent and they would not be able to distribute this. Or in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is now in negotiation with, I think, Ghana for it to reallocate its over 1 million vaccine doses received from COVAX, which is set to expire in the next couple of weeks. And it apparently cannot distribute this. So this is one situation where we have a discrepancy. And even when these vaccines are available, for example, through the COVAX initiative, which is largely reliant on the AstraZeneca vaccine, we're seeing problems around distribution. But, there are also some countries in Africa that have kind of made significant progress. So a country like the Seychelles, which has a small population of just about 100,000 people, has been able to vaccinate about 67% of its population. And then another country, Morocco, has vaccinated about 14% of its population. But overall, progress has been slow. And according to most projections that I've seen, the continent may not be able to vaccinate up to 60% of its population until late 2022 or early 2023, right? So, this is the discrepancy. Of course, there are implications for the continent's economic recovery, because according to the IMF, in its World Economic Outlook that it released a couple of weeks ago, it made it very clear that the effective rollout of vaccines will shape the strength of the global economic recovery. And countries and economies with slower vaccine rollouts will perform poorly. So on that basis, the African continent, according to its projections, will grow by about 3.4% in the year 2021. But this really depends even on effective vaccine rollouts. And this growth projection is much lower than for the average across the world, which is around 6%. So this is really what we're dealing with, that if this discrepancy, these inequities continue, there are going to be real implications, for the African continent in terms of its economic recovery, in terms of rising poverty rates, in terms of also the ability of governments to have significant fiscal space to be able to do the business of government, to be able to provide services. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to you.
Ja, herzlichen Dank, Zainab, so weit.
Many thanks, Zainab, so far. Maybe another questions. We are talking about Africa as it would be a country. I don't like that at all. It is a whole country with very diverse countries and very different economic and socioeconomic conditions. So you have named a few examples already, the Seychelles, where isn't any vaccine available? What are those countries? Can you give us a few figures about the worst cases?
So I probably don't have precise figures because these things change all the time, and everyone is really trying to keep up with the developments that happen every day. But I think I can give you a few headlines, right, in terms of how many countries so far have access to what kinds of COVID-19 vaccines, because this is the other dynamic. So for the COVAX initiative, which is the multilateral initiative through which many stakeholders, many entities, and many countries are providing their support and their donations, I think COVAX covers about 27 countries so far, or has delivered vaccines to about 27 African countries so far. And out of these 27 countries, there are some, of course, the population in each country varies, it's different. So some countries have, a few million doses, some have, a lot more, and some have already depleted most of the supplies. Actually, this is the one challenge that many countries are facing now, including, Ghana, which is trying to negotiate this reallocation of the COVID-19 vaccine for the DRC, which it cannot distribute domestically. So Ghana has depleted its supplies already, Nigeria as well, and there are discussions right now as to how best African countries can maximize the current supplies that they have. So there's COVAX, which is number one, which has supplied at least 27 countries, but its own supplies are drying up because it is mostly based on the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, which is supplied by the Serum Institute in India. And now we're all aware of, India's own domestic challenges with COVID-19 resurgence, and the fact that it has now put in place export restrictions. So there's COVAX. Then there's also there are vaccines supplied by Chinese companies or Chinese entities, the Sinopharm in particular, and Sinovac to a lesser extent. At least I think 29 countries have received both donations and purchased supplies from these two Chinese vaccine producers. Then there's also Sputnik from the Gamaleya Institute in Russia, which I know has been in talks with the African Union for the supply of about 300 million vaccine doses. But also there are bilateral arrangements with Kenya that I'm aware of, and with I think it's Guinea, if I'm not mistaken, and probably a few other countries like that. So at that kind of big level, kind of macro continental level, you have a number of countries that have various arrangements with different producers, is what I'm going to say. on that. But overall, the Seychelles is a country that has the highest rate of vaccine coverage of 67%. 67% of its population has so far been covered, then probably followed by Morocco. But for the most part, I think less than 5% of the population of any African country on average has received a COVID-19 vaccine.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wir kommen sicherlich später.
Many thanks, Zainab, surely we will talk about the influence of Russian and Chinese producer. I would now like to include Tahir Amin. Please, could you switch on your video so we can see you? He is a British journalist and a co-founder and co-director of the non-governmental organization Initiative for Medicines, Access and Knowledge, IMEC, and he has been a legal consultant for the European Patent Institution, the Environmental Program of the United Nations, and the World Health Organization. We have had the pleasure of exchanging ideas in other contexts about, for example, what justice and solidarity really means in times of pandemic. So what does it really mean? What is the risk that the industrialized countries are incurring when they are trying to deal with this pandemic, with this worldwide distribution? What is the unfortunate condition to not fight against the pandemic globally? It is a pandemic and it affects us all and needs help urgently.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me again to join you. I think the situation we have is we have a lot of different interests that play here. You have the pharmaceutical industry that is trying to preserve its interests. And when I say interests, I talk about the issues that are happening at the World Trade Organization, because the trading laws and how intellectual property works is at the heart of this matter, particularly when we think about the lack of available doses and the supply chains that are really holding us back in getting vaccines to as many people as quickly as possible. And I think Zainab's aptly described some of the issues that are facing the continent of Africa, but this issue is also relevant to a number of other countries too. And what is really, I think, is the sticking point here is really there's been a real lack of leadership in terms of, particularly in the global north, hanging on to existing systems, structural systems, which really do not serve us in a pandemic. And this continuous clinging to an intellectual property system and then making up smokescreens and excuses that, oh, it's a lack of raw materials or supply which is causing the problem, rather than really dealing with the root of the matter. I mean, it baffles me to think that if we didn't relax some of these rules, that we might actually get other supplies or even raw materials. You know, just some research I've been doing recently, you know, trying to tackle this smokescreen that keeps getting put up, is there are actually, there's been an immense amount of consolidation even in the raw materials sector. So no wonder there's a lack of raw materials, is because the way that the system has worked, and some of these raw materials also have IP on them too. So this argument that keeps getting put out that, oh, well, you know, even if we bring in other manufacturers, we won't be able to scale up because it becomes a raw material problem, and we'll be siphoning off important raw materials that Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca can use. So, essentially what they're saying is leave the monopoly to us and we will deal with the problem. And I think that's not going to get us anywhere. And if you look at the projections, many countries might not even see a vaccine until 2024. So what's happening at the WTO is of central importance to how we are going to solve this problem going forward.
Okay, dann steigen wir jetzt noch mal in Micha's Res.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I think we could talk directly about the TRIPS waiver in Indian Africa. Of course, you follow on the discussions in the World Trade Organization. So how do you assess the current situation of the negotiations about the temporal suspension of the of trips? Many hundred countries are supporting the proposal. Biden has announced that he will. And how do you assess the European reaction and the very loud and vehement protests of the big pharma?
Yeah, it's been, I mean, just to sort of even just start from the announcement that the United States made last week, I think it's a significant moment if anybody who has followed the history of the World Trade Organization and intellectual property and the US position on these issues, you know, in past public health emergencies and even on a more regular basis, the United States will never, at least verbally, put any kind of support behind the weakening of IP systems. So in that sense, it was a significant step. But it's important to recognize that the language that was put out with the press release actually says we support a waiver in relation to COVID vaccines. And for those of our viewers who are listening today, it's important to recognize that the original proposal that was put forward by India and South Africa and a number of other countries, that proposal was for all types of technologies that you can use to address COVID-19. So it could be IP that might be in relation to sort of oxygen. There may be things that are relevant there, or PPE equipment or ventilators, all these things which are essential, or future treatments that may emerge, such as drugs. And so already we're seeing a narrowing and a restriction that the United States has already put forward. It's an important step, but at the same time, we now have to understand what it's going to be in terms of what that text looks like. And as from the European position, it was quite interesting that, you know, the United States moved and made an announcement, and then all of a sudden you have Macron and you have a few other countries saying, okay, yeah, we think it's a waiver is important. So it just shows the power of the United States when it comes to the global trade regime and intellectual property. Yet, you know, if reports are true, and you could probably tell me more, you know, Angela Merkel has actually stated that she's actually against an idea of a waiver, although they are slowly moving into position. Even Bill Gates' foundation, the Gates Foundation, after saying that transfer of technology is not the solution, all of a sudden now supports a restricted waiver. So it's quite interesting seeing all these people who are saying actually IP is not the problem, all of a sudden now saying IP can be, you know, a waiver is actually useful. So people who want to be on the right side of history and slowly are kind of recognizing that now that the US has said this, hopefully there's a channel now where we can start to have these negotiations. But what's going to be critical now is still, obviously, there are some European countries that are questioning. I mean, the UK hasn't said anything on this issue and has been resisting and opposing. But I think now it gets down to the language, and having spoken with some people in South Africa and in India, the question is what they're going to do now in response to the United States language. Are they going to go back with their own text and say, well, actually, we want this broader proposal. We don't want it just to be for vaccines. And this is going to go back and forth now. And so this could take some months before it actually gets resolved. We hope it doesn't. We hope that actually the urgency of the situation means we get this resolved very quickly. But you can bet that the text of these negotiations are going to be secret. And we need to be pushing for them to be transparent and public, because if you look at previous history around trade negotiations, the pharmaceutical industry will certainly be getting copies of those texts, and they'll be influencing it. So it's important for us as the public to actually have a voice in them.
Mm-hmm. Ja, ein sehr wichtiger Punkt, die Transparenz.
It's a very important issue, the transparency indeed. And it is publicly known that in the second half of May, we will have a second series of informal negotiations. The text is elaborated and worked upon, and then this will be forwarded to the World Trade Organization. I would now like to ask Zainab, how is the reaction of the African states when they heard about the announcement? Of course, this is one argument, one criticism. Who are the countries who have the capacity and the know-how to produce the vaccines themselves? So who would be the runners on the African continent to be able to produce the vaccine. So what is the reaction on behalf of the announcement?
Great. I think this is a very, very important question. And I'm glad that we have Tahir on the panel, who is a lawyer, who is also, closely following the details of these negotiations. I think it also would have been great to have a representative of, the government of one of these EU countries, so we can get a sense from them, kind of hear from the horse's mouth, why is there reluctance to support this TRIPS waiver, which seems to make sense to most other people. I want to provide this context, which we're all aware of, but to kind of remind us of it. We are in an unprecedented time where there is a common threat to humanity, but unfortunately, it seems quite difficult for unprecedented action to be taken. So it would be good to hear from the representatives of countries that appear to be reluctant to support a global initiative to make vaccines available widely to everybody. So that context was what I thought, maybe we all need to be reminded of. In terms of the reaction of African countries, so last week when we all heard the news that the US government indicated its decision to support the proposals being put forward around the TRIPS waiver, the African Union certainly expressed its happiness at this development, the Africa CDCs as well, and also individual African governments. But I think these entities are also quite mindful of what my colleague on this panel mentioned, that there's still a lot that is yet to happen. These negotiations are ongoing, and my understanding of how the WTO works is, it works on a consensual basis. They try to rally consensus around any topic or any issue. So this is where the support of other powerful countries will be quite instrumental. Certainly, the leadership by the United States is very important. It helps to rally as many countries as possible. But the WTO does not just work on the basis of a simple majority. If that was the case, then I'm sure the TRIPS waiver would have actually come to pass, so to speak. Because right now we have over 100 countries supporting that proposal by India and South Africa, and now we have the US and a couple of other governments. But other powerful countries, including the UK, Germany, Canada, we are yet to hear from them. So we hope these generally across the world, we hope these negotiations actually bear fruit, is what I would say. But the other question around capacity that you raised, that even if everything that we wish for, that we hope for, everything comes to pass, what African countries have the capacity? So I think what this pandemic has done, as well as the challenges around equitable vaccine access, what all of those things have done is that they have served as a wake-up call to many countries around the world, particularly in Africa. A couple of initiatives have come up around shoring up vaccine, but also broader pharmaceutical capacity on the African continent. So a high-level conference was done about 3 weeks ago in terms of how to actually make vaccine manufacturing a reality on the African continent. And apparently there are countries with significant capacity to produce not just pharmaceuticals, but vaccines in general, and also some COVID-19 vaccines in particular. So South Africa is certainly one. As South Africa already is going into, there's a pharmaceutical company that is going into a partnership with Johnson & Johnson to produce, I think, up to 300 or 400 million vaccine doses for the African Union over the next 1 year or so. But there is capacity in Egypt, in Morocco, in Nigeria, in Senegal, and I think with some potential also in Ethiopia and Kenya. So there is capacity. And I think I would like to echo the point made by Tahir on this panel that, you know, sometimes some of these debates around the fact that, you know, the IP waivers are not sufficient, sometimes they are smoke screens. Because certainly I don't think anyone is saying that IP waivers are going to suddenly resolve the problem of sufficient manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines. What people are saying is that this is going to be an essential first step to ensure that the countries that decide to go it on their own to start scaling up manufacturing do not get sued by these pharmaceutical companies at the WTO. So there is, the capacity exists. Yeah.
Sorry, sign up, please.
No.
I have, sorry to interrupt you. Entschuldigung, Sie zu unterbrechen.
Sorry to interrupt you. I have to announce the following, that Tahir has to leave at 6 o'clock. I have many opportunities to discuss with you the Chinese and the Russian influence on the African continent and when it comes to the vaccine delivery and distribution. So now I would like to, and this is also to you, Tahir, I think our audience is not part of the expert TRIPS discussions. So once again, I would like to ask you, first of all, where does this optimism come from that you have uttered that there might be, that we might see a historic moment that for the first time in history, the TRIPS agreement, Article 31 will be applied, which means a crisis situation that allows for a patent waiver? This is the first question. And the second question is, one of the criticisms towards the pharmaceutical industries and also the position of our government is that the patent protection should be suspended, but that this is not sufficient, that we need many other measures. And I do share this view. We need a whole bunch of measures. But why is the waiver of patent protection so relevant and so important in the fight against the pandemic?
Yeah, no, so I'm going to actually answer your second question first and then get to the Article 31 bis. What this waiver does is, it's important to recognize. I mean, I know because intellectual property is one of these very technical subjects, there are a lot of different aspects of intellectual property that go into making a vaccine. Patents are just one of them, patents are just one of them. And so what this waiver tries to do is it actually removes any kind of intellectual property that might go into a production of a vaccine. So it could be trade secrets, things that aren't actually in any kind of document that are held by a company. It could actually mean copyright. For example, some of the research that we're doing, there may be sort of machinery that you need to use that actually may have software that might be proprietary. There could be designs on some of these materials that you need to use in making a vaccine. So there are all different pieces of intellectual property. And what this waiver does, it says, well, we're going to basically suspend all these types of, and so if you're a manufacturer out there who could potentially reverse engineer and make your own vaccine, you will not have to worry about these various intellectual properties. So whereas, something like Article 31 bis is more of a public health emergency situation and applies that to sort of waiving patents, that actually is really a subset of this bigger waiver. The waiver would just even override that, and it would just cancel all intellectual property. So you wouldn't even have to worry about Article 31 bis. I mean, I know many of us in the legal field want to improve that article because it's actually not very good, particularly for export and what have you, which the Europeans have kind of removed themselves from in terms of their legislation. But I think what this would do is actually it would override all of that and make it much easier. We won't have all this bureaucracy that would go with compulsory licenses and all these other things. There's been one argument that particularly people say, well, we don't need a waiver, we can just use the existing flexibilities. Well, actually, historically, we've seen that the existing flexibilities don't work. And what about flexibilities in relation to clinical trial data? That is not something that you can get a compulsory license for. There are a number of facets, like trade secrets, you can't get a compulsory license for. So this is why this waiver is so broad, in order to remove every potential bottleneck. And I think, just to pick up on what Zainab was saying, there is potential manufacturing there. We've been speaking to a lot of manufacturers, both in India and other countries, and there's a belief, and people who've worked in the field of drug development and vaccine development, and even from my own research, there's a potential that with a waiver, we might actually get at least a few companies who can actually go it alone without any technology transfer. And remember, it's important to recognize a waiver does not compel any of these companies to transfer their technology. All it does, it just removes the obstacle of their intellectual property. Ideally, the second step would be that these companies voluntarily share their information and knowledge so that we can speed up some of these companies to try and get producing. If we do that, that would actually at least cut the sort of predicted 6 months it would take somebody by themselves to figure all this out and get into production. Then if we got direct technology transfer, some of these companies could be up and running in 3 to 4 months. So again, those are the couple of steps. And then we also need to solve some of these supply and raw materials issues, because there are probably a handful of raw material suppliers which are actually being just serving, the Pfizers, the Modernas, and the AstraZenecas. We need to increase that base. We need new supplies. And, the argument is that if we actually remove the intellectual property barriers, we're going to see new suppliers. It's common sense, because at the moment it's a kind of a consolidated protective industry. And that's why we don't have enough of these suppliers. Of course, no one's ever lived in a pandemic situation like we have today, but that's why we need to build this stuff out. And so, a lot of people are kind of making these gestures of, oh, well, it's not going to be immediate, so we don't need a waiver. Well, actually, what's immediate? 2024, people are still going to be waiting for vaccines. If we can get people running in 6 to 8 months, that's immediate enough. So, I think there's a lot of sort of deflective messaging that's going on, and the people need to understand that, it's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen.
Ja, eine kurze Antwort, wenn Sie...
Maybe one brief answer. If you know the answer, Brazil is a country that also has or would have production capacities. Brazil is an emerging economy with the autocrat Bolsonaro in power, and he is a corona denier. Why does Brazil not support India's and South Africa's waiver? So they were an alliance in the past, BRICS, for example. Do you know it, Tahir?
It's a good question. I think it's basically, what's interesting is that there was a recent decision, I think, in the Senate in Brazil to suspend IP. So it now has to go to the other chamber. So it's interesting, even domestically, Brazil is trying to actually suspend IP even in its own domestic legislation. Parliament. So, ironically, at the WTO, they're not supporting it, but internally they're having this battle to try and suspend IP. So, obviously Bolsonaro is somebody who believes in the free market. And I say free market, there's no such thing as a free market. But it's something that he believes in, and that's why they're not supporting it. And obviously, to curry favor with the sort of the existing power structure. But I think Brazil's coming under immense pressure. I think once other countries, the Europeans, move into place, I think Brazil's resistance will wave. And it's interesting to see what's happening in Brazil itself. Just last week, the Supreme Court said patent extensions are actually illegal. So already we're seeing domestic shifts in Brazil itself in terms of what they're doing vis-a-vis IP. And there's one thing that we should mention. The WTO does operate on a consensus basis, as Zainab says, but there is a nuclear option which is never being used, and that nuclear option is where basically the sponsors could take it to a vote, and that's rarely done, and that's where the majority can play in. But it's I don't think that will happen. Because it's never been done, but there is that possibility. And I know the sponsors, in South Africa and India, obviously don't want to go that route because it becomes very messy then.
Darf ich Ihnen noch eine Frage stellen?
May I ask one other question before you unfortunately will have to leave us? One main argument here in the media and in the political discourse is we can not waive the patent protection and freely distribute licenses, because this would hamper the innovative power in the pharmaceutical industry. And there's the strong narrative that the pharmaceutical industry itself is the innovative factor which promotes new products. However, the vaccines have been developed. The mRNA vaccine was, of course, developed by the pharmaceutical industry, however, with billions of subsidies from public funds. So how do you counter this argument, this narrative that despite the fact that public funds were involved?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about particularly pandemic preparedness and these, new pathogens, I think the WHO blueprint from 2015 says it very clearly. It says the market-driven model for R&D for dealing with, public health emergencies and breakouts like new pathogens. Actually, the market-driven model doesn't work. And, if you look at the data that's out there, the pharmaceutical industry, out of all its wealth, say, for example, you take the top 20 pharmaceutical companies and their revenue, which is some 661 billion in 2019, they didn't even put 1% of their earnings into neglected diseases. So to tell me that they are the drivers of innovation in these kinds of pathogens and these kind of sort of pandemic type preparedness is not true. They don't do the innovation there. They may do innovation or inventiveness in other aspects. Even some of those are public dollars. If you like, some of the highest earning drugs on the market today often come from public funding. So this notion that we are not going to get new vaccines or new development. Sure, the vaccine space is a very peculiar area, and we do need to keep companies interested. But it's not as if they are going to walk away from this situation without making any profit. I mean, Pfizer last week announced $26 billion. Moderna's already going to be sort of making anywhere between $10 to $18 billion. And, some of the market capitalization of Moderna, a company that never even actually brought anything to market, could be worth $100 billion. So to tell me that they are actually going to suffer out of this, in fact, they've got the biggest global market that anybody has ever had. And it's going to continue. I mean, in fact, if you listen to some of the investor calls, that there was a leak of an investor call where Frank Emilio, the CFO of Pfizer, said actually, as we turn into an endemic situation, which is what this COVID is going to be, he says we see a significant opportunity where we can increase our price. And there's even been saying that they're going to increase the price once they get out of this emergency phase of increasing the vaccine to like some $150, $175. So the question has to be asked is actually, is it in the interest of Pfizer to even actually vaccinate everyone? Because as these more variants come about, it's in their interest and their profit lines to actually keep people having to take their vaccines. And we're going to need booster shots. So they're always going to make money. They're always going to actually get something out of this. So the idea that it's going to kill innovation, I think, is a red herring.
Ja, vielen Dank. Sind Sie noch bereit für zwei
Many
Fragen?
thanks, Tahir. Do you think you have time for 2 questions from the audience?
Yeah, I've got about another 5-6 minutes here.
Okay, good. Okay, Alexandra, dann spricht die
All right, Alexandra, so please go ahead. Great, thank you, Tahir, for your availability. We have 2 questions. The opponents of the waiver in Germany say that there is a restrictive raw material policy in the US. The question is, to what extent the US administration is really credible or consistent? And then second, why do licenses and raw materials have to be opposed to one another? And then we have a second question. Can the raw materials not simply be produced as commons in the commons?
Yeah.
as important as the suspension of the the patent rights are, it should be a common right.
Right. So just so that I hope, just to make sure I've understood the first question, there has been this issue where the United States has been blocking raw material supplies to other countries. For example, India has been complaining. Serum Institute has been complaining about asking the US to release bans on exporting of raw materials, which goes to show that again, this is something that we're trying to unpack still, but based on some of the initial research that we've been doing and others, there is actually a bottleneck in the raw material markets, largely because there's a consolidation of a few actors. And what we need to do, and what the IP waiver would do, because some of these raw materials do have IP on them, it would actually release other potential suppliers to come into the game. People can actually then enter. And, to answer the question about it being more of a commons, I think the more actors you get in, the more competition you get in, the more you remove these bottlenecks. And so I think this idea of raw material problem is again, it's not going to change in the next 10 days. It's going to have to be built up. But the fact that we need these raw materials and we need this new infrastructure, both globally, I think is the right step to take. And now, could some of these existing manufacturers also license their sort of IP in relation to these raw materials? They could. It's not just about the vaccines. It could be about licensing other potential manufacturers to make these raw materials. I mean, some of the Indian companies we've spoken to, they're saying, raw materials is actually not the issue. We could start producing these raw materials tomorrow if, we had no IP barriers. So again, whether it be the actual vaccines, the technology, or whether it be the raw materials that go into them, the bottleneck is because of the way the systems work and the consolidation of power. And we need to actually open this space up to a more sort of available suppliers that can actually take this on.
Allerletzte Frage.
And the very last question, I think this will remain unresponded. Wilma Reimer says or asks what Biden might have driven to do so, because he is doing harm to his own pharma industry. And Pfizer in the US, of course, is responsible for a large portion of vaccine production. Of course, we cannot take a look into the minds of them, but any idea that might have driven him?
Well, the FT had an interesting article which actually disclosed the discussions that went on about this decision. And some are saying that actually it was a political decision to essentially saying that they're not going to really lose anything out of this. And so essentially that's one version. The other version is that this could be a stick and carrot approach. Is if they use this stick of the waiver, companies might start to actually negotiate transfer technology themselves. And so, of course, there are all these potential possibilities that could play out. It might be that the US, if companies start giving technology transfer themselves, that the negotiations are ongoing and there's a sort of a bottleneck in terms of the negotiations. They can't agree. But in the meantime, you've got some action going on bilaterally between companies. The US will say, look, we did the right thing anyway. So I think some of this is political. I don't think it's going to totally harm him with the pharma industry. The question is, though, is where he has played the hand is going to apply in the long run and for the domestic issue of drug pricing, because now people are starting to connect it to, like in the US, there's big issues on insulin drug pricing and everything. So people will use this as a way to say, what, we can do this at home as well, which, I think is an important point. So it remains to be seen. It's a tightrope that he's walked, given previous policy.
Gut. Ja, Tahir.
Well, many thanks, Tahir. Thank you so much for being with us, for your time, for sharing your insights and ideas with us. Thank you so much for being with us. Of course, I have tons of open questions and there's a lot of curiosity from our audience, but I wish you all the best and see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, be safe. Thank you. Thanks, Ada. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, so now we keep on working. Thanks for your participation. It was not the right slide here, and I'm working still with sign up, and Alexandra will provide us with the questions from the audience. I would now like to dig a bit deeper into the geopolitical issue. This, of course, is the title of our panel, and this is why I would like to ask Sign Up, what do you know about you were talking about Russia and China previously, of how Russia and China will use the vaccine in order to have targeted actions and to influence African governments and win them over. Those are questions of reputation. Who are the ones providing vaccines? May there be deals on the plate for the future? So how do you assess the influence made by Russia and China?
So that is also another interesting question, in the sense that I guess it's quite important to remember that this is a pandemic where many countries, of course, have been seriously affected, but are also in need of support that they do not seem to be getting. So I really can probably not speak to what the intentions of the Chinese or the Russians are. But what I can say is, there's a gap there in terms of being able to respond to the needs and the priorities of African countries. And, anyone is free to try to help African countries, and they've been issuing out SOS calls, more or less. With regards to vaccines in particular, clearly the COVAX mechanism is the main vehicle through which EU countries, North American countries, and other wealthy countries around the world have channeled their support to developing countries, including those in Africa. But clearly, COVAX is not sufficient. To begin with, it's only going to supply a maximum of 20% coverage of vaccines that will cover a maximum of 20% of the population in any given country. But even at that, the supplies are insufficient because, as we discussed earlier, it is mainly based on AstraZeneca vaccines supplied via India through the Serum Institute. But India has also placed its own export restrictions to address the domestic challenge at home. So with that, we know with all of the challenges around what is quite frankly a very, very good initiative, a good multilateral initiative in the form of COVAX, there's a gap there that suppliers from China, from Russia are attempting to fill. So as I mentioned earlier, COVAX, I think, has been able to cover about, I think it's about 27 countries, whereas now we've seen China providing both donations, but also purchase supplies to about 29 African countries. As at early this week, they had provided about 10.6 million vaccines from Sinopharm, but also from Sinovac to these 29 countries. Russia has provided, as I mentioned earlier, about 300 million, or offered about 300 million vaccines from the Sputnik V vaccine to the African Union, as well as other kind of bilateral arrangements. The other thing I'll mention here is that what we've seen the Chinese doing through the Chinese government primarily is that for the African continent, supplies of these vaccines, you typically start with donations that are given to these countries, and the donations tend to be less than 500,000 doses per country. So it's usually anything between 50,000 doses to 500,000 doses that are donated to an African country as a goodwill gesture, which then opens up a space to negotiate a purchase by the African government. So on that basis, countries like Morocco, Zimbabwe, and Egypt have purchased anything between 1.8 million doses to 20 million doses in the case of Egypt of these Chinese vaccines. And discussions are underway right now to start manufacturing the Sinopharm, I think either Sinopharm or Sinovac in Egypt and in Morocco in particular. So it's actually something quite interesting that is going on there, that there's a gap that can be filled, is not being filled, that, you know, China and to a lesser extent Russia are responding to the needs of African countries around these vital vaccines that will be key to the continent's economic recovery. So let me just mention one more thing on this front. You have all probably been following the news, you know, what we learned last week, that the two Chinese made vaccines are under review at the World Health Organization. In fact, one of them, Sinopharm, has received emergency authorization, while Sinovac is probably going to get the same emergency authorization very soon. So this means that more countries might probably take up these Chinese vaccines.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Many thanks, Zainab. I would have another personal question that I saw pop up on the chat. Before, in one of your first statements, you mentioned that COVAX has delivered expired vaccines. Are there complaints from the governments? How do they deal with those issues? And so then the second question would be, if China and Russia try to position themselves by the means of those donations and try to open up markets. So is this something that the population of the different countries really perceive? Are they aware of that? Does it work? Do they say, okay, it's now the Chinese that try to support us? Or do they see that they deliver expired or bad vaccines? How is the reaction in the civil society when Sputnik and Sinovac are delivered to the countries? Those two questions, then I think we will close up.
Yeah, okay. So with regards to expired vaccines, so it is not that COVAX has delivered expired vaccines, no. It is that in some cases, the vaccines that have been delivered had expiry dates that were quite imminent. So in the case of, I think, South Sudan and probably Malawi and a few others, they received the vaccines and then they realized that the expiry dates were, let's say, within a 1 month period. But then they did not have the arrangements to deliver or to distribute those vaccines very quickly. So they had to dispose of them to ensure that, you know, there's no mistake in a situation where, you know, people end up getting vaccinated with something that is expired, where also in a context that you have in some countries significant vaccine hesitancy, you know, with conspiracy theories and fake news making the rounds. So it is not that COVAX delivered expired vaccines. It is that the vaccines that were delivered had expiry dates that were quite imminent. And in some poor country, very, very poor countries or countries with a lot of challenges, they just did not have the infrastructure to quickly administer and distribute those vaccines. So that's a response to that question. But I guess the other part of it is also how African governments have responded to that. I think, you know, governments, at least what I've seen so far.
Ja, nicht nur der Regierung, sondern auch der Bevölkerung.
Not only the governments, but as well the civil society. So,
yeah. So, to be honest, I've not seen. I've seen some media reports. I've not really tracked how civil society in particular has, has responded to the issue of expired vaccines on that front. But more broadly, well, the Africa CDC has also tried to allay fears, and they're trying to find out also from the World Health Organization whether once a vaccine reaches its expiry date, it means that it absolutely cannot be administered. I think there's still information that is that people are trying to collect, and they're trying to get to make sure that informed decisions are made. So with regards to, then comparing what is going on with COVAX, whether it's the expiry, but also the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is the other thing, right? The negative coverage that this vaccine has received. People, what I know for sure, ask the question you asked about responses by civil society. What I have seen for a fact is people are also following developments in Europe. So people are aware of the fact that a number of European countries like Norway and so on and so forth, at various points in time, had to pause the administration of the AstraZeneca vaccines for all sorts of reasons. So people are closely tracking what is going on, but there's still uptake of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And finally, with regards to the Russia and the Chinese vaccines, to be honest, I don't think people, at least from what I've seen, it doesn't seem as if people are necessarily just thinking of geopolitics in the way they frame these issues. There are certainly people who do that. There are thinkers, there are scholars, there are journalists who can try to look at the global picture. But for the most part, to be honest, people are worried about their daily lives. There are still countries that are under varying degrees of lockdowns and restrictions. Infection rates are rising in a number of countries. So in Nigeria, for example, they're also in Kenya, they're putting in place new sets of lockdowns. So I don't quite think many people are thinking in terms of, the geopolitics, in terms of who is supplying vaccines to whom.
Ja, dann vielleicht so Richtung.
Well, maybe we can now come to my last question. So if you think of the fact that the poorer countries will be immune through sufficient vaccine supplies in the year 2023 to 2024, what do you think is now absolutely necessary? What needs to happen at the moment that we see more distribution justice? The head of the WTO has only 2 weeks ago made quite clear, well, Europe is now vaccinating children at the age of 12 and above, whereas in Africa, not even 2% of the population has seen the vaccine. So how do you assess the debate? I mean, it is very strongly about solidarity and justice and so on.
Yeah, so what needs to happen next? What should happen next? So certainly the discussion we had earlier that, it would be good to see some kind of consensus reached at the World Trade Organization regarding these IP waivers. Of course, that is not going to address, the supply challenge immediately, but it is an important first step. At the same time, and I'm aware that this is already happening, different companies in a number of developing countries, including in Africa, and also governments as well, are trying to negotiate with the big pharmaceutical companies, particularly in the USA. So the president of Rwanda is trying to actually have an mRNA vaccine production facility in Rwanda within the next, couple of months or a year or so on. So it's, concluding those WTO negotiations is one. Secondly is, having those bilateral discussions, company to company discussions, but also with governments. And I think this is where, again, a country like the United States, and also, given the platform that we have right now, the European Union can also facilitate those discussions. can try to nudge these companies that are hosted in the European countries to try to come to the table and negotiate some kind of technology transfer discussion to ensure that vaccine production is ramped up. The other thing I'll mention is this is certainly a wake-up call for many countries across the world, because this is not the last pandemic we're going to have, to ensure that the health security is something important they think about in their national strategies. And the final point I'll mention is that, as we're waiting for these negotiations to be concluded at the World Trade Organization, and whatever comes out of that, as we're waiting for ramp up of production, I think at my own perspective is in the short to medium term, it's also for poorer countries, including those that are in Africa, to come up with ways of really coexisting with COVID-19. And I don't know what that means, because at least for the next 1 or 2 years, it does not look as if there's going to be widespread vaccine availability. So how to coexist with this virus? How to ensure that the poorest people are not left behind, the vulnerable do not suffer the most, as they're already suffering right now. So how do you coexist with this in the short to medium term while we're waiting for vaccine access and distribution?
Ja, wunderbar. Ich glaube, das war...
Well, thank you very much. I think this was a good summary of what we need to do. On the one hand, we have to enhance the production capacities, we have to improve distribution, and COVAX needs to be equipped with completely different tools and funds. We need to waive the export controls for raw materials and intellectual property protection, because this is a huge factor in the fight against the pandemic. We need new capacities, but we also need, and thank you for mentioning this aspect, throughout the whole world, we need a rethinking of the healthcare systems. So what is going wrong in the healthcare systems? In our country, I mean, there's a lot of money in the system, but still many things go wrong. And of course, in the African countries, we very often have only rudimentary health systems. I really do hope that you are right, Zainab, with your wake-up call. I hope that people have heard it, that people have realized that we need to invest in infrastructure, health protection, prevention measures. All this is part of what we need in order to reduce inequality, to reduce poverty. And this pandemic is just one moment where we have to realize that health, safety, poverty, and inequality are closely linked. In this spirit, I would like to thank you very, very much. You are now alone on the panel together with me. I'm very sorry that Adriana Abdenur had to cancel at short notice, because we would also like to hear about the Latin American perspective, and Tahir had to leave a little bit earlier. So thank you very much that you stayed with us, and I wish you a nice evening and also every success in your work and your fight for more justice, not only with view to the fight against the pandemic, but in general. I wish you all the best, and I would like to say thank you for listening and joining us here for this Böll.Global number 7. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you for having me. See you soon.